Well, good afternoon. My name is Paul Miller. I'm the Associate Director of the Clements Center for National Security here at UT. It's a pleasure to see you all here. As I think probably most of you know, the Clements Center exists to train the next generation of national security leaders. And for those students of you in the room, we hope that's you. We're making an investment in you by all the things that the Clements Center does, by hosting guest speaker events like today's, conferences and forums, by sponsoring research, as we sponsor our postdocs and pre-docs right here. And a variety of other activities. And we're happy to continue to do this. Today, it is my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Max Boot. Max Boot is the Jeane Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow in National Security Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. He's a prolific writer, military historian, and a foreign policy analyst who's published a number of books and writes regularly in places such as Commentary, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The Weekly Standard, the Los Angeles Times, and elsewhere. If you're here, I'm sure you've heard of Max and you've read some of his stuff, some of his articles and his books. I first encountered his writing as a graduate student many years ago when I was assigned his book, The Savage Wars of Peace, Small Wars and the Rise of American Power, written very shortly after 9/11. It was published, I think, in 2003. And those of you who've taken any class in American history or military history, you've probably gotten the conventional history that covers the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War II, kind of the big ones. And Max has written the other one, right? He's written a history in this first book of his on all the small wars of American history. It's a very eye-opening account of the different kinds of military operations the United States has undertaken in its history. And that's how he started. He's also written Invisible Armies, an epic history of guerrilla warfare from ancient times to the present. A very large book that covers insurgency, small wars, not just American, but throughout history. And of course now, his newest book that we'll be hearing about today, The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam. We're very happy to hear about this book. Perhaps some of you were at the LEJ 3-day conference about a year and a half ago on Vietnam. Kind of a reappraisal of the Vietnam War, about 50 years on now since the war. And we're seeing an increasing amount of scholarship focusing on the war and reappraising its prospects. Max has also served as an advisor to U.S. military commanders in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was a foreign policy advisor to several presidential campaigns. On his biography, I noted this as well. In 2007, he won the Eric Brendel Award for Excellence in Opinion Journalism, given annually to a writer who exhibits love of country and its democratic institutions and bears witness to the evil of totalitarianism. I didn't know he won this award, but I'm not surprised to learn that he did, because it comes through very clearly in his writings. Max writes with a love of the United States, of American ideals, of the ideas of ordered liberty and freedom, and a trenchant critique of all forms of illiberalism. And I deeply appreciate that part of his writing. Please join me in extending a warm welcome to Max.
Whoops. I guess I'm not going to take this off the podium. Okay, never mind. Plan B. Thank you very much, Paul. Really appreciate the warm introduction and the chance to come here and be with all of you. Are you here with the mic kind of down here? Okay, cool. I don't have to use my parade ground voice. Good. It's a delight to be here with all of you to talk about my new book. There it is, The Road Not Taken, which I'm very happy to report is a New York Times bestseller, and feat all the more impressive in that it was achieved without being denounced by the president. So I'll do the best that I can without President Trump's help. The subject of my book is this man, Major General Edward G. Lansdale, who was certainly one of the most unconventional, perhaps the most unconventional general officer in the history of the U.S. Air Force, or quite possibly any other service. He has been much written about. He was said to be the model for both the quiet American and the ugly American. He's also been written about by just about every major author on the Vietnam conflict, sometimes in laudatory terms and oftentimes in not so laudatory terms. And for those of you who are internet surfers, you will also very quickly find that there is a burgeoning Lansdale kill JFK conspiracy industry. And if you believe what you read online, This is actually a picture taken on Dallas on the day of President Kennedy's assassination. And if you believe what you read online, this man seen from the rear is supposedly General Lansdale. And these are not tramps being led away by the Dallas police, but conspirators in this grand plot to kill JFK. All of which, spoiler alert, all of which is ludicrous, but nevertheless, this was actually, believe it or not, the basis for Oliver Stone's movie JFK, which a lot of people probably believe has factual foundation. Let me quote to you from something that one of Lansdale's bureaucratic rivals, Major General Brute Krulak of or Lieutenant General Brute Krulak of the Marine Corps said about him. He said, "There are few individuals in my knowledge more damned and at the same time applauded. History is going to have to portray Lansdale's real part." Well, that's where I come in. I've spent the last 5 years studying Ed Lansdale, and I am the voice of history here. So what I'd like to do today is to just very briefly give some of my findings about who was Edward Lansdale, beyond the myths, beyond the legends, beyond the mythology. Who was the real Edward Lansdale? Well, for starters, he was a middle-class kid who was born in 1908. That's him with his family. That's his father, Harry, who was an automotive executive in the early days of the automobile industry, and sometimes the family was flush, other times they were bust. Ed Lansdale was certainly not to the manner born. He was not part of this East Coast establishment. He did not go to an Ivy League school. He did not work on Wall Street like so many of the shapers of post-World War II U.S. foreign policy. He was from much humbler roots. He born in Detroit, spent a couple of years in Bronxville, but spent most of his childhood in LA, and he became a quintessential Californian. He was very laid back, very easygoing, did not like neckties, did not like regimentation, did not like bureaucracy, did not like meetings. You could say that he was kind of a proto-Silicon Valley guy decades before Silicon Valley was formed. A couple of other aspects of his upbringing are worth bringing out very briefly. One is that although Ed Lansdale, first off, was not a good student, I mean, he should give hope to every C student everywhere, but he was very devoted to the writings of the founding fathers. He was particularly, he would just read all these documents in these collected volumes that his father had. And he loved the Declaration of Independence, he loved the Constitution, and those principles, the principles embodied in those documents really became his lodestars in charting U.S. policy in Asia in the post-war years. The other point worth bringing out is that Lansdale, of course, in the 19-teens and 20s grew up at a time of virulent racism, especially in California, against Asian Americans. And this was a prejudice that he never shared. Reading all of his writings and interviews and all the rest of it, I didn't find a single racial epithet, which is very uncommon for somebody of his day. Even people who were relatively liberal-minded and progressive often used derogatory language, which he never did. He always looked upon others as being fellow human beings, not being part of some separate and alien race. This too became part of his secret of his success in places like the Philippines and Vietnam, because he treated Asians as being complete equals and did not condescend to them, did not look down upon them. And I think part of the reason why he was so free of prejudice is that he himself was a minority, something that previous accounts haven't really made clear, even though he was a white middle-class Anglo of his day. His family were also Christian Scientists, which was at that time a very small religion that was looked down upon. And so he had the sense that he was a minority. I think that gave him an identification with outcasts that would stick with him in later life. While Ed Lansdale went to UCLA, he dropped out a few credits shy of graduation, and in the 1930s he moved to New York hoping to become a New Yorker writer or cartoonist. Like a lot of people with those kinds of aspirations, he didn't quite make it and instead went into advertising. And this is Ed Lansdale right there with some of his colleagues at a San Francisco ad agency in 1940, where he was pretty successful. This is one of the ads that he created. That's Lansdale up there in the corner. He had a flourishing career going when the day that will live in infamy, December 7th, 1941 occurred. And as you might imagine, his life, like the life of the entire country, was utterly upended. Lansdale wanted to get into the war, but had a hard time doing so because he was overage and had some medical issues, and so he was not immediately accepted into the Army. Instead, he went into the OSS, America's first civilian intelligence agency. But he was not sent abroad. He spent the war years stateside, interviewing travelers who had vital information about these exotic destinations where U.S. troops would shortly be landing, from North Africa to these unknown islands in the Pacific. And in the course of doing that, Lansdale proved himself to be a very skilled interviewer, a very good listener. And those too would be skills that he would take with him in his later career in Asia. Now, in the fall of 1945, as millions of American GIs were preparing to come home as the war was ending, Ed Lansdale shipped out on his first overseas assignment to the Philippines. And this was Lansdale on this little rice boat that he went on to survey some of the newly liberated islands taken from Japan. He was fascinated by everything he encountered, whether it was in Japan or primarily in the Philippines, and he really tried to immerse himself in the local society and to learn as much as he could. One of the things that he was interested in was the Huk Rebellion, H-U-K, this burgeoning communist movement in the Philippines in the wake of World War II. And he set out to learn as much as he could about the Huks. This is Lansdale in the mid-40s right there, surrounded by some captured Huks. But he wasn't just interested in the military situation like a conventional Army officer would be, and by this point he had joined the Army and would shortly switch over to the Air Force. His interest extended well beyond the purely military realm. He was really interested in everything in the Philippines, in folklore, in their myths, in their food, in their economic conditions, and he made constant forays into the countryside to learn as much as he could. Now by this point, 1945-46, Lansdale had been married for a number of years. In 1933, he had married this woman, Helen, a small-town girl from upstate New York, and they had a couple of kids. But when he went to the Philippines, he met this woman, Pat Kelley, who was a Filipina. Her last name came from her late husband, who died in the war and who was of Irish-Filipino ancestry. And she was a very unusual person in the Philippines in the 1940s. She was not only a single mother, she was a working mother. She worked as a journalist, a very strong, independent woman, who eventually had a long career working for the U.S. Information Agency in Manila. And she was initially of interest to Lansdale because she came from the same part of Luzon province where many of the Huk leaders were from. She had even gone to high school with some of them. And so she took Lansdale on these forays into the backcountry to meet as many Huks as they could on these very dangerous expeditions so that he could figure out what was going on. And in the course of these adventures, a friendship developed, and before long, a romance. And Pat Kelley, became really the love of Ed Lansdale's life. And this is a relationship that is almost unknown up until now, and that I was able to tell and to show its importance for Lansdale both personally and professionally because of this. And this is what biographers would call a gold mine, because these are the letters that Pat and Ed exchanged, their love letters exchanged over many years, which nobody else had ever seen before, and that I was lucky enough to track down Pat Kelley's granddaughter, who actually lives in Northern Virginia, and she shared those with me. I was also lucky enough to have cooperation from Ed's boys. When I say boys, of course, they're now in their 60s and 70s, who live in New York and Florida, and they shared with me the letters that he wrote to their mother, Helen, his first wife. And so I'm actually the first person after Ed Lansdale himself to read both sets of letters, written both to his longtime mistress, Pat Kelley, as well as to his wife, Helen, often simultaneously, and giving really an unparalleled view into the inner Ed Lansdale in a way that nobody else has ever had before. And one of the things that leaped out at me right away, of course, as I mentioned, was that Pat Kelley was not just important to him personally, although she was incredibly important personally, but also professionally, because she really served as an interpreter of Filipino culture for him. She served as a gateway for him to understand this country in which he found himself in a way that few foreigners are able to do. Of course, reading these letters and understanding the inner story of what Lansdale was going through also brought up some awkward personal episodes, like, for example, what happened in 1947, 1948, when Ed's wife Helen and their boys Ted and Pete joined him in Manila. And of course, he was still very much seeing Pat Kelley at the same time that Helen and the boys were living with him for a year in Manila. And this was, for a great secret agent, this was one of his major covert operations, was to juggle these two women simultaneously. He actually asked Helen for a divorce. She refused, and this being the 1940s, very hard to get a contested divorce, and so they stayed married. but he would spend much of the next decade or so deployed in Asia while she was at home raising the kids, and I think doing a pretty great job under the circumstances. But it was this background in the Philippines from 1945 to 1948 that set the stage for the making of the Edward Lansdale legend. And that began a couple of years later in 1950, at a very dark time for the United States. This was, of course, when the Korean War was raging. This was shortly after the communists had seized power in Beijing, shortly after the Soviet Union had acquired an atomic bomb, and of course while McCarthyism was rife domestically. So there were widespread fears in Washington at the time that all of Asia was about to go quote-unquote red. And of course, including the Philippines, where Louis Tarok, the leader of the Hooks, appeared to be the next major communist leader in Asia set to seize power. But there was little willingness in Washington to send troops to fight the Hooks for the simple reason that we are already fully deployed in Korea. And so instead of sending multiple army divisions to defeat the Hooks, the decision was made at OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination, this very small, very secret covert action arm of the U.S. intelligence community that would shortly thereafter be folded into the CIA. The decision was made by Frank Wisner, the head of the OPC. Instead of sending all these army troops, let's send Ed Lansdale and a handful of associates to defeat the Hook Rebellion. Now that's a pretty tall order, and yet he proceeded to do just that. And how did he do that? Well, it began with these kinds of coffee clatches in his bungalow in Manila. There's Ed Lansdale at the head of the table. There's his good friend, New Yorker correspondent Robert Chaplin. This is his eccentric deputy, the former anthropologist Bo Bohannon, who's like a character out of MASH. And here's some of the Filipinos with whom they were working. And this photo is actually very emblematic of Lansdale's approach, because as I mentioned, he was a laid-back Californian who hated regimented meetings, who hated agendas, who hated bureaucracy, all that kind of stuff. What he liked were these kinds of free-flowing conversations over coffee in his bungalow, brainstorming sessions essentially, where they came up with the ideas that would defeat the Hook Rebellion. The most important initiative that he took was to cultivate this man, Ramon Magsaysay, who at the time in 1950 was a newly appointed defense minister of the Philippines, having just stepped down as a Filipino senator. He was a former guerrilla fighter against the Japanese. He was energetic, honest, not corrupt, and wanted to get things done, but he wasn't sure how, and that's where Lansdale came in. He became Ramon Magsaysay's virtual one-man brain trust, and they became very close. This is Magsaysay and Lansdale touring the countryside together. They became, in fact, as close as brothers. They were even roommates for a while, and together they developed what would today be called counterinsurgency doctrine. A lot of this stuff has become conventional wisdom within the U.S. military, but it was far from conventional in the early 1950s when Lansdale was developing a lot of these ideas, including this notion that it's counterproductive to use too much force, that if you kill a lot of innocent people, you're going to create more enemies than you eliminate. And so one of the big initiatives that Lansdale and Magsaysay undertook was to tell the Filipino army to stop bombarding barrios, to stop using these heavy-handed tactics, to pull back and to embrace the people. And what Lansdale preached was that if you treat the people as brothers, they will come to trust the army, and then they will rat out the insurgents in their midst. And that's kind of coined counterinsurgency 101 as developed by Ed Lansdale. Now remember that Lansdale was also a former ad man, and as a former ad man, he loved psychological warfare, which is the military version of advertising. And remember also that he had all this knowledge about Filipino folklore and myths, and he was fascinated by that, including by all the legends that surrounded the aswang, these vampires that were said to haunt the Filipino countryside. And so Lansdale decided to mobilize the aswang against the Hooks. And he did this by having a Philippine army unit take a dead Hook and put a couple of holes in his neck, and then spreading a rumor campaign that the aswang were after the Hooks and to instill terror of supernatural forces in these guerrilla fighters. This became a big part of the Lansdale legend, and back at CIA headquarters in Washington, people would say, "Can you believe what this guy Lansdale is doing?" And it has since been recounted in countless books and even novels. But there was a lot more to Lansdale's approach than these kinds of psychological tricks. The essence of his approach was really political, because he understood that the Hook's slogan was bullets, not ballots. And why bullets, not ballots? Because people didn't trust the ballots. The elections were rigged, kind of like in Texas in the 1940s and 50s. You couldn't always be sure that you would get an honest count. And in the Philippines, unlike in Texas, people took matters into their own hands by launching an armed insurgency among all these aggrieved farmers who were being victimized by this land-owning elite. And because they could not affect political change, they decided to try to pursue a revolution at gunpoint. And so Lansdale understood that the key to defeating the Hooks did not lie in the military arena, it really lay in politics and giving people confidence and hope in the political process again, so that they would feel that they could get their grievances addressed through peaceful means. So he did things like enlisting Filipino civic organizations in order to safeguard the vote, to prevent voter fraud. But his masterpiece was the campaign to elect Ramon Magsaysay as president of the Philippines in 1953. And if any of you are interested in running for president, you could probably do a lot worse than to peruse the top secret memo that Ed Lansdale wrote to Allen Dulles, and which has only recently been declassified, in which he laid out exactly how he did it, how he won the Philippine election of 1953. And there was nothing especially underhanded about it. I mean, he wasn't stuffing the ballot box. It was a free and fair election. But essentially, Lansdale was acting as Magsaysay's covert campaign manager, doing things like composing a campaign song for Magsaysay and composing a slogan, "Magsaysay is my guy." And so Magsaysay became known as the guy throughout the Philippines. And all of that was very effective when coupled with Magsaysay's well-earned reputation as an honest reformer, and that led in 1953 to a landslide win, and here's Magsaysay getting inaugurated as president of the Philippines, and it led to a new nickname for Lansdale, who became known as Landslide Lansdale. But this was really the crowning glory of his anti-Hook campaign, because the election of Magsaysay took away the rationale for the Hooks to continue their fight. Louis Turok gave up the struggle shortly thereafter. Most of the other Hooks surrendered, and this became one of the great unsung Cold War success stories for the United States, with this communist insurgency defeated without putting a single American soldier into combat. And so, as you might imagine, when Ed Lansdale got back to Washington, he was very much the flavor of the month. And here he is with CIA Director Allen Dulles, who became a great fan. And of course, as the U.S. was starting to encounter another major problem in Southeast Asia, naturally, for Allen Dulles, Ed Lansdale would be at the center of his thinking about how to grapple with it. And of course, that problem began to unfold in 1954 when the French were losing the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. This, by the way, is a picture that I took in this new museum in Dien Bien Phu, which I would recommend anybody who happens to find their way to that corner of Vietnam. Very interesting. But in 1954, this was not obviously a tourist attraction. This was a killing field. And it was of great concern to the United States, because as a result of the events in Dien Bien Phu, you had the Geneva Convention, the Geneva Conference, which split up Vietnam into two. And of course, you had northern Vietnam, which would be under Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh, i.e. the communists. And there was supposed to be a new non-communist state created in South Vietnam. But the question was, how on earth do you create this functioning state where none has existed before? And that's where Allen Dulles and his brother John Foster Dulles thought of Ed Lansdale, who had shown that he knew a thing or two about waging political warfare in Southeast Asia. And so it was that in the summer of 1954, Ed Lansdale found himself in Saigon. And his marching orders from Allen Dulles were quite literally, do what you did in the Philippines. And remarkably enough, he did. And the first thing that he did was to cultivate a new protege. Just as he had cultivated Ramon Magsaysay in the Philippines, in Vietnam, he cultivated this man, No Dinh Diem, this Catholic Confucian Mandarin who had served under the French before quitting in disgust and had credentials as both an anti-colonialist and an anti-communist leader. He was appointed Prime Minister of the new state of South Vietnam in the summer of 1954, but very few people thought that he would last 9 weeks, much less 9 years. And the fact that he successfully navigated those rocky early days owes a lot to the relationship that he forged with Ed Lansdale, the advice that he got from Lansdale. Now, this was not easy to do, because Lansdale literally did not speak Siam's language. Although Lansdale had a genius for winning the friendship of foreigners, he was kind of a typical American in that he only spoke English. And this was not much of a barrier in the Philippines, where many people spoke English. It was much more of a barrier in Vietnam in the 50s, where almost nobody spoke English. And of course, French and Vietnamese were the language of the day, but even though he had to use an interpreter, Lansdale, seen here with Diem, was very effective in forging a bond with Diem, just as he had with Magsaysay. How did he do it? Well, he did it by listening instead of lecturing. Now that seems kind of obvious, but for Americans it's a little bit counterintuitive because we love to go to the developing world and to lecture the people that we find there. And this was not at all the way that Lansdale approached these things. He forged bonds of friendship and trust, and he really listened. And that was not easy to do in the case of somebody like Diem, who became notorious for his multi-hour long monologues, which bored most Americans to tears. But Lansdale was made of sterner stuff and probably had a stronger bladder. And he would sit there for hour after hour listening to Diem drone on. At the end of that time, he would say, well, that's fascinating, Mr. Prime Minister. If I understand what you're saying, it's X, Y, and Z. And then he would proceed to rephrase what Diem had told him, injecting his own views as if they were Diem's own. And that was a very subtle, very effective method of influencing Diem by making him think that he had come up with these ideas himself. So using those kinds of methods, at which he was truly a master, Lansdale enlisted Diem and got his support for his very ambitious program to bolster and create this new state of South Vietnam with projects like Operation Passage to Freedom, in which Lansdale enlisted the U.S. Navy to move 900,000 refugees from North Vietnam to South Vietnam, many of them Catholics, thereby greatly strengthening the new state of South Vietnam. And of course, Lansdale being Lansdale, he also felt compelled to help the migration along with propaganda, such as hiring a soothsayer to predict a negative fortune for North Vietnam and good fortune for South Vietnam. Now, these kinds of initiatives were not necessarily beloved by everybody in the U.S. bureaucracy. In fact, a lot of people looked askance at what Lansdale was trying to do, including his very own boss, General Lightning Joe Collins, this hero of the Pacific and European theaters in World War II, who was the U.S. ambassador in Saigon, and very conventional mindset, successful military man, but not really attuned to counterinsurgency or what was going on in Vietnam per se. At their very first country team meeting, Lightning Joe Collins suggested that it was time to spend less money on the South Vietnamese army because he thought it cost too much. Lansdale disagreed because he said, well, you know, the Viet Minh are vacating all these areas of the countryside, and the Army is the only part of the government that can do anything, so we need to have the Army go in there and bring governmental services to the people. We also need the Army to absorb all these sect militias so we don't have a lot of private armies running around South Vietnam. Well, Collins listened to a little bit of this and he said, okay, that's fine, but I am the personal representative of the President of the United States, and you're out of order, mister. The decision has been made. Sit down. Well, at that point, most colonels, as Lansdale then was, would have in fact sat down. But remember that Lansdale was this inveterate maverick and troublemaker. And far from sitting down, he stood up and said, well, General, you may be the personal representative of the President of the United States, but I am convinced if the people of the United States could hear what you were saying, they would disagree with you. And I'm here to speak up on behalf of the people of the United States. And on behalf of the people of the United States, we're walking out on you. And out he walked and slammed the door. Now, there are very few, as Colonel O'Connell there can probably attest, there are very few colonels who can get away with that kind of impertinence to a four-star general. Don't try this at home. But Lansdale survived episodes like this one because he had backers even more powerful than a four-star general. He was backed by the Dulles brothers, who were truly the kingmakers in Eisenhower's Washington in the 1950s. And that became of central importance during the pivotal episode of Diem's early tenure in power, the Battle of Saigon in the in the spring of 1955, when with Lansdale's encouragement, Diem sent the South Vietnamese army into the streets of Saigon to battle all of these sect militias that were contesting the power of the state. It was touch and go for a while. The battle was close and bloody, and Collins wanted to jettison Diem at that point. But Lansdale went behind his back, went straight to Allen Dulles, and had the President of the United States overrule his own ambassador in Saigon and continued U.S. support for Diem. And with that backing, Diem was able to win a victory, and Lansdale won a victory too because he got Lightning Joe Collins relieved. As a result of all that, by the time that Lansdale left Vietnam at the end of 1956, CM was pretty well entrenched. And here you can see him walking through an area in the provinces that had been pacified under Lansdale's direction. And Lansdale also encouraged CM to go out and meet his people, something that this very shy and aloof leader was not naturally prone to do. So by the end of 1956, South Vietnam was seen much as the Philippines had been seen a couple of years earlier, as a shining Cold War success story. CM got a ticker tape parade on Broadway. He addressed the joint session of Congress. Life magazine lauded him as the miracle man of Southeast Asia. And for the small number of people in the know in Washington with the top level security clearances, they knew that who was really responsible for the miracle man's success. And that, of course, was Ed Lansdale. And here he is getting a medal from Vice President Nixon as his wife Helen looks on. By this time, the Lansdale legend was becoming an outsized one, because in the 1950s you had the publication of Graham Greene's novel The Quiet American, which was widely supposed, if erroneously supposed, to be based on Lansdale, and the publication of The Ugly American, where one of the few positive characters was Colonel Edwin Barnum Hillendale, who truly was based on Lansdale, because the co-author of the book was Navy Captain Bill Lederer, who was a friend and admirer of Lansdale's. So by the end of the 1950s, I think it's fair to say that Lansdale, who had achieved his greatest success working for the CIA as an Air Force officer, by the end of the 1950s, Lansdale was probably the least secret agent on the planet. He was actually pretty famous. And so when the Kennedys took over in 1961, they were immediately drawn to what they perceived to be this man of action. They called him the American James Bond, the T. Lawrence of Asia, the Ugly American. He had all sorts of nicknames. And initially, President Kennedy and his brother Bobby were extremely impressed by Ed Lansdale. But in the end, Ed Lansdale's legend would be the beginning of his own undoing, because the Kennedys developed unrealistic expectations for what Ed Lansdale could do to help them address their number one most pressing concern. And what was that? Of course, it was a small island 70 miles off the coast of Florida, headed by this man, Fidel Castro. One of the very first things that occurred in the Kennedy administration, if you will recall, was the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which was not just a black eye for the United States, but was seen by the Kennedys as a personal affront. That the way they viewed it was Castro had humiliated Jack Kennedy, and President Kennedy was going to get his revenge. They were going to overthrow or kill Castro. They didn't really care which, but they were going to get this guy, and they were going to get him good. However, by this point, they had lost faith in the CIA, which had been responsible for the Bay of Pigs debacle. And so instead of turning to the CIA to get rid of Castro, they decided to turn to the American James Bond. And so at the end of 1961, Ed Lansdale became operations director of Project Mongoose, this interagency effort to overthrow or kill Fidel Castro. Now, what Lansdale determined in pretty short order was that it was going to be a very difficult, if not impossible mission, because the only way you were going to overthrow Castro in short order was with an American military invasion. But the Kennedys didn't want to send the U.S. military into Cuba. What they wanted was some kind of covert action gimmick that would allow them to get rid of Castro without risking American troops in combat. And Ed Lansdale was supposed to somehow come up with this magical solution. And so Operation Mongoose worked on things like this. This was a CIA propaganda leaflet featuring Gusano Libre, free worm, because Castro called his enemies worms. And so the CIA thought that they would turn this against Castro by creating this mascot for the anti-Castro resistance. And here he is shown sabotaging power lines. Now, undoubtedly, this was probably the cutest mascot that any insurgency has ever had, but it wasn't that successful. In fact, it didn't achieve much at all. The one thing that Mongoose achieved was it generated the intelligence which allowed policymakers in Washington to learn that Nikita Khrushchev was putting nuclear missiles into Cuba. But after the conclusion of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, Mongoose was disbanded, and Ed Lansdale was essentially left defenseless against his many, many bureaucratic enemies, because he had lost the favor of the Kennedys. And chief among these enemies was his own boss, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. Lansdale and McNamara were like oil and water. McNamara came to the Pentagon from having run the Ford Motor Company, Harvard Business School graduate, also a graduate of Berkeley, my alma mater, worth pointing out. He was a one of the best of the brightest, somebody who loved numbers and believed that the truth could be found in numbers, especially running into these newfangled things called computers. Whereas Ed Lansdale, of course, was a UCLA dropout, did not have this illustrious academic pedigree, but had spent a few years knocking around Southeast Asia, which McNamara had not done. And so when McNamara took over in 1961, Lansdale tried to begin educating him in the kind of war that he was about to encounter in Vietnam. And Lansdale had just returned from a trip to South Vietnam, and he came into McNamara's office with a load of weapons that had been captured from the Viet Cong. Very simple weapons, old rusty handguns and a few rifles and spears and so forth that had mud and blood caked on them, and he dumped those on McNamara's immaculate desk. And he said, you know, Mr. Secretary, the people who are using these weapons don't look like the kind of soldiers that you would recognize. They don't wear uniforms, they don't march in formation, they wear black pajamas and wear sandals, but they are looking the soldiers on our side who are trained and equipped in a mirror image of the U.S. Army, because these soldiers, these very primitive guerrillas, they have the power of an ideal that they are pursuing, and the only way we're going to defeat them is if we give the Vietnamese soldiers on our side the power of a competing ideal. We're never going to bomb this revolution into oblivion. Now that, in hindsight, was pretty wise advice, but McNamara was invincibly armored by his arrogance and ignorance, and so he ignored what Ed Lansdale had to say and dismissed him because he thought that Lansdale was a simpleton who did not understand the higher mathematics that McNamara would use to win the Vietnam War. As a result of that, by the time that South Vietnam reached a crisis point in 1963, Ed Lansdale had essentially no influence on the Kennedy administration's policy towards that country. And of course, the crisis came about in 1963 because of a revolt by militant Buddhists. You had Buddhist monks setting themselves on fire in the streets of Saigon. And this led the Kennedy administration to conclude that the only way they were going to win the war against the communists was by getting rid of Diem. This was something that Lansdale counseled against. He was very aware of Diem's flaws, but he said, you know, we have to work with this guy because there's no better alternative. Please send me out there and I will get him to rule in a somewhat more consensual fashion. I will displace his conspiratorial brother, No Dien Nhu, who's a very negative influence. But he couldn't get that done because he had so many bureaucratic enemies. He couldn't get to Saigon. And the Kennedys disregarded what he had to say about Diem and also what he had to say about Diem's purported successors, because Lansdale said, you know, I know all these generals who want to take over from Diem, and I know that they're going to be more incompetent, less legitimate, less honest than Diem was. Things are actually going to get worse, not better, if you get rid of Diem. And tragically, that advice was disregarded. And in early November of 1963, at the very same time that Lansdale was being retired from the Pentagon, the U.S.-backed military coup against Diem went ahead, which shortly thereafter resulted in the murder of No Diem and his brother No Dien Nhu. Now, the consequences of that coup were every bit as catastrophic as Lansdale had predicted. The state of South Vietnam all but collapsed. You had military coup following military coup, which involved wholesale changes in the leadership of the army and the provinces and the districts and all the rest of it. And as this was going on, the Viet Cong massively stepped up their infiltration. They later called Diem's overthrow a gift from heaven for us. The situation got so bad in 1965 that President Lyndon Johnson decided he had no choice but to send American combat troops into South Vietnam to rescue that state from communist takeover. Now, that was the last thing that Ed Lansdale ever wanted to see. He never wanted to see 500,000 American troops thrashing around the jungles of Vietnam, but his advice was consistently, and I think, again, tragically, ignored. Now, in 1965, Lansdale went back to Vietnam, trying to help, this time working as a civilian official at the U.S. Embassy, working for this man, Henry Cabot Lodge, the U.S. ambassador. It did not go well because, of course, Lodge was the very same ambassador who in 1963 had orchestrated the overthrow and murder of Lansdale's friend, No Dien Diem. Now, in the past, when Lansdale had dealt with an ambassador that he didn't get along with, like Lightning Joe Collins, he could just go over his head and get him overruled by Washington. Not so easy to do in the mid-1960s because Lansdale's primary patron at that time was Vice President Hubert Humphrey, who was well-intentioned but also almost powerless to affect Lyndon Johnson's decision-making on Vietnam. And Lansdale also did not have an effective local protege in the way he had before with Magsaysay and Diem. He tried to work he tried to work with Win Cao Ki, who was this very flashy Air Force marshal who became prime minister and then vice president of South Vietnam. But Ki lost a power struggle to Win Van Tu, who's the general who eventually emerged on top in the military junta. And so Lansdale had neither a powerful patron in Washington nor an effective protege on the ground, and he was virtually without voice as the American war effort careened along its conventional path with the free fire zones, search and destroy missions, bombing raids on North Vietnam, all these other horrors that Lansdale denounced. He couldn't believe it when he would hear General William Westmoreland say that he was going to kill the Viet Cong faster than they could be replaced. He consistently warned that this was a foolish way to pursue this war, that unless you created a stable, legitimate, popular government in South Vietnam, you would never win the struggle. You couldn't simply kill the enemy faster than they could be replaced. But Westmoreland wasn't listening, Lyndon Johnson wasn't listening, and Lansdale's warnings only gained true force in 1968 with the Tet Offensive, which occurred almost exactly 50 years ago today. And Lansdale very quickly perceived that the Tet Offensive was not this big military victory that General Westmoreland said it was, even though the communists failed to ignite a major uprising and the Tet Offensive was crushed militarily. It was nevertheless a potent psychological blow against the war effort because it turned most Americans against the war. By the time that Lansdale left Vietnam for the final time in the summer of 1968, he was very much disillusioned, dejected, and defeated because he knew that the war was all but lost. And he was not terribly surprised when a few years later North Vietnam invaded South Vietnam, by then the husk of a state which quickly collapsed. Now the intriguing question to ask, and which I in fact ask in the title of my book, The Road Not Taken, was there another road that we could have taken, a Lansdalean approach, that would have produced greater success? Of course, this is in the realm of counterfactual, and we can never know the answer to that. But of one thing I think I can be fairly certain, which is that if we had followed the Lansdale approach, we would not necessarily have won the war because, of course, North Vietnam would have been a very formidable adversary under any circumstances with more will to win than we had. But if we had followed the Lansdale approach, at the very least, we can say that we would not have lost 58,000 Americans in South Vietnam, and we would not have had millions of Vietnamese killed in the crossfire, because Lansdale never wanted to see this big conventional war effort. He did want to support South Vietnam, but he wanted to do it at a very low-scale advisory presence of the kind that he had previously undertaken in Vietnam and in the Philippines. And he was not listened to, and he, till the end of his days, he was haunted by this sense of failure and these what-ifs and wondering what would have happened if, for example, he had been sent to Saigon in 1963 to work with CM before the coup took effect. So in the end, this was not a story with a happy ending, but there was a bit of a personal happy ending for Lansdale, because after his first wife, Helen, died, his longtime love, Pat Kelley, who was still unmarried and living in Manila at the time and just retired from the U.S. Information Agency at the U.S. Embassy, came to the United States. And on July 4th of 1973, they got married. And this is them in the kitchen of their home in Northern Virginia. They lived happily ever after until Lansdale's own demise from natural causes in 1987. This was a very moving experience for me, visiting Lansdale's grave at Arlington National Cemetery, because I felt like I really knew the guy, and in some ways better than my own father, because I had studied him so closely for 5 years and was privy to such intimate thoughts that he had put down in these letters to Pat and to his first wife, Helen. And I've tried to tell that story in ways that I think are surprising for me. I certainly didn't expect when I started out that I knew this would be a military history, but I didn't realize the extent to which it would also be an adventure story and also a romance. I mean, I'm a knuckle-dragging military historian, and so I'm not used to writing romance, but I was quite moved by the romance between Ed Lansdale and Pat Kelley. One other aspect of the story that I would bring out in closing is that I do think it has resonance for the present day. Today we are engaged in another major counterinsurgency campaign, this time not against communist insurgents as in Lansdale's day, but against Islamist insurgents. And how are we going to win the war on terror? I would submit we're not going to win it with American combat troops. We're not going to send hundreds of thousands of American troops to occupy the greater Middle East. Been there, done that, tried, it didn't work. Not going to happen again anytime soon. So if we're not going to win this war with American troops, how are we going to win it? I would suggest we're going to win it with American advisors by sending small groups of military personnel and diplomats to these far-flung countries on the front lines of the war on terror to help them stand up their own governments and their own militaries to battle our common enemies. And when we think about advisors, we need to think about Ed Lansdale, who was one of the most successful advisors of the 20th century, right up there with T. Lawrence. So as we think about how these advisors should function today, I think there are a lot of lessons, both good and bad, positive and cautionary, that we should take away from the experience of Ed Lansdale. And I think Lansdale's influence has been limited so far in part because, unlike Lawrence, he was not a very influential writer and did not really set out his own story in a very compelling fashion. And so I've tried to make up for that by telling his story my way, but also, presenting, I think, both the successes and the shortcomings of Ed Lansdale. And so that is the book before you, and I'd be delighted to take questions or comments.